He walked into the courtroom wearing nothing that gave away who he really was. No stars on his shoulder, no medals on his chest, just a tailored suit and a calm presence. The room barely noticed. To most, he looked like any other black man in court. The uniform was gone, and with it, the recognition. But what hadn't left was his story, his sacrifice, and his service to the nation. Still, none of that mattered to the officer sitting across from him. The one who smirked, scoffed, and leaned over to whisper something under his breath to a colleague. A quick laugh followed. A laugh born not from humor, but from assumption. This moment wasn't unique. It was a mirror reflecting what many people of color face in institutions meant to uphold justice. The courtroom, in theory, is where everyone is treated equally. But reality often tells a different story, one where bias seeps through uniforms, robes, and badges. In this instance, the officer's reaction said everything. He didn't see a man. He didn't see a veteran. He didn't see decades of loyalty to the country. He saw race. He saw a stereotype. He saw someone he believed to be beneath him. The tragedy here isn't just that this decorated U.S. Army general was misjudged, it's that it happens all the time. Every day, individuals are treated based on appearance rather than character. But this moment cut deeper because of the layers involved. This was a high-ranking military leader, someone who had commanded troops, made life-or-death decisions, defended the Constitution. And yet, stripped of his title and civilian clothes, he was reduced to just another defendant in the eyes of someone who should have known better. There is a powerful irony in the fact that the uniform, which often demands automatic respect, had to be absent for this story to unfold. Because it exposed a raw truth, respect, for some, is conditional. It is based not on the person, but on symbols. Take away the symbols, and all that's left is the way society truly sees you. That courtroom became a stage for this harsh reality to play out. The laugh wasn't just a moment of poor judgment, it was the echo of a system that has long devalued certain lives over others. This story is about perception. The perception that fuels quick judgments and assumptions. The kind that sees a black man in court and immediately places him in a category: criminal, problem, threat. Even when that man has spent his life defending the very freedoms that allow that officer to sit there in uniform. It raises uncomfortable questions: how many others are misjudged the same way? How many stories go untold because the individual didn't have the rank, the record, or the resources to demand recognition? The truth is, implicit bias doesn't always wear a white hood. Sometimes it wears a badge. It wears a robe. It even wears a smile. And it doesn't announce itself, it hides behind professionalism, behind procedure, behind just doing my job. But in this moment, the bias was visible. It was in the laugh. In the smirk. In the dismissal. And that's what makes this story so powerful, not because it's rare, but because it's common. That single moment, when the officer laughed, wasn't just about ignorance. It was about the arrogance that often accompanies unchecked authority. It was about the quiet entitlement that assumes, "I know who you are," before asking a single question. It's a reflection of a society that often values appearance over truth, assumption over facts, and prejudice over understanding. The courtroom should be the most equal place in the country, a place where facts matter, where justice is blind. But when even a U.S. Army general can't walk in and be seen for who he is, what does that say about the treatment of everyday citizens? What does it say about how deep these assumptions run? The laugh from that officer wasn't just a mistake, it was a message. A message that said, "I've already decided who you are." And that's what's dangerous. Because when those in power stop seeing people as individuals and start seeing them as categories, fairness disappears. And so does justice. The courtroom is supposed to be a space where the truth is weighed without prejudice, where justice is not influenced by race, status, or background. But the presence of deep-rooted bias, particularly from those entrusted with upholding the law, often tells a different story. In this case, a police officer, in uniform, laughed at a man he believed was just another defendant. That man, however, was a high-ranking Black U.S. Army general. The interaction didn't happen in a vacuum, it's a reflection of the quiet, often invisible racism embedded in institutions like law enforcement, where stereotypes aren't just personal opinions but active forces that shape behavior and judgment. The officer's reaction was not just disrespectful, it was revealing. It showed that even someone who has dedicated their life to serving and protecting the very nation that police officers claim to protect can still be reduced, in the eyes of law enforcement, to nothing more than a racial stereotype. The general was not seen for his record, his discipline, or his sacrifice. He was seen for his skin. And what followed was a moment of dismissal, mockery, and superiority. This behavior is not rare. It's the manifestation of bias that has been nurtured over time within policing systems, reinforced by generations of unchecked power and assumptions. Bias in law enforcement doesn't always scream. Often, it whispers, in glances, in body language, in tone. It lives in the way some officers approach certain people with suspicion before a single word is spoken. It lives in how they perceive authority, threat, or guilt based not on actions but on appearance. The laugh in the courtroom was not just a chuckle, it was an audible release of a stereotype the officer felt confident enough to express in public, without fear of consequence. That's because this type of bias has been normalized. It's been passed down, learned, and rarely challenged from within. When an officer can look at a man who has worn the uniform of a general and still find it appropriate to laugh, that reveals a fundamental flaw in the culture of law enforcement. It says something about the training, or lack thereof, regarding racial sensitivity. It speaks volumes about how certain officers are conditioned to see black men, not as individuals, but as a monolith of suspicion and assumed criminality. The fact that this general's achievements didn't even register before judgment was passed shows that, to some, blackness alone is enough to negate merit. This is more than just individual prejudice, it is institutional. The justice system has been shaped over centuries by policies, practices, and attitudes that disadvantage people of color. Officers are part of that system, and whether consciously or unconsciously, many act in ways that reinforce those same power dynamics. The general's presence disrupted the narrative, but only after he asserted his identity with a single phone call. Until that moment, his worth was invisible to those who refused to see past his race. The danger of this kind of bias is that it doesn't require explicit hate to function. It survives on assumptions. On quick judgments. On snap decisions made in moments where character is not considered. And when those assumptions come from people in power, especially those who are supposed to protect and serve, they carry consequences far beyond a disrespectful moment in court. They shape outcomes. They decide who gets listened to, who gets protected, and who gets punished. This story underscores how the presence of racism in law enforcement isn't always about dramatic acts of violence. Sometimes, it's about the quiet moments that go unchecked, the microaggressions that build up over time, and the culture that excuses them. A laugh may seem small, but in this context, it was loud. It was a declaration of bias. It was a moment that encapsulated the broader experience of being black in America, even when you've done everything right. That laugh reflected years of conditioning. It showed how deeply the idea is embedded that black men, especially in court, are automatically assumed to be wrong, guilty, or inferior. The officer didn't ask questions. He didn't look deeper. He just judged. Because that's what bias allows people to do, it skips the need for evidence and jumps straight to assumption. It strips people of their humanity and replaces it with caricatures that justify mistreatment. The general's presence in that courtroom challenged the stereotype. His quiet confidence, his authority, his experience, all stood in contrast to what the officer expected. But it's worth asking, would the laugh have even happened if the general had been white? Would the assumption have been the same? These questions are uncomfortable, but they are necessary. Because until law enforcement confronts the biases within its own ranks, moments like this will keep happening. Not just to generals, but to everyday people who don't have rank to protect them. Power comes in many forms. There's the kind that's visible, uniforms, titles, badges. Then there's the kind that's invisible, character, integrity, presence. In the courtroom that day, both were in the room. The police officer had the visible power, the authority of the badge, the confidence of the uniform, the belief that his assumptions would go unchallenged. But the Black U.S. Army general, stripped of his visible symbols of power, held something deeper. He carried the weight of lived experience, the discipline forged through service, and the quiet strength of someone who had earned every ounce of his position. What played out was a collision between these two forms of power, the perceived versus the real, the superficial versus the substantive. The officer didn't recognize the general. He saw a black man in a courtroom and assumed the worst. That assumption came not from knowledge, but from perception, a deeply embedded societal lens that equates race with status, color with credibility. The power the officer believed he held was rooted in a system that reinforces certain hierarchies. His laugh wasn't just a personal reaction, it was a performance of authority. It said, "I know who you are," even when he didn't. It said, "I don't need to question myself, because the system supports me." That perception is dangerous, because it gives people in positions of authority the false confidence to act on bias without fear of accountability. The general's power, on the other hand, didn't need to announce itself. It didn't rely on a badge or a title being flaunted. It was calm, measured, restrained. It didn't seek confrontation, because it didn't need to prove anything. But in that courtroom, the general's power was invisible to those unwilling to see past the surface. It wasn't until he made that one phone call, until the truth of his identity was revealed, that the dynamic shifted. Suddenly, the man the officer had laughed at became someone important. Suddenly, the badge didn't feel so dominant. That's when perception collided with reality. This moment exposed how shallow our understanding of power can be. Society often teaches us to respect symbols, the suit, the badge, the rank on a collar. But what happens when those symbols are removed? Does the person behind them still command the same respect? For the general, the answer should have been yes. His life of service, leadership, and sacrifice didn't vanish with his uniform. Yet, to the officer, none of that mattered until it became undeniable. The general was powerful long before that phone call. The officer simply failed to recognize it. There is a unique kind of strength that comes from knowing who you are, even when the world refuses to see it. The general's composure in the face of disrespect was not weakness, it was restraint. It was the discipline of someone who understands that true power doesn't need to be loud. It was a form of leadership the officer could not comprehend, because his own sense of authority was built on external validation. He needed the uniform, the courtroom, the structure of the system to feel powerful. The general didn't. This story also speaks to how power is perceived differently depending on race. A white man in that courtroom, even without a uniform, might have been given the benefit of the doubt. He might have been seen as respectable, educated, successful. But a black man, regardless of his achievements, too often has to prove himself over and over just to be treated with basic dignity. The officer's reaction was not an isolated moment, it was part of a larger pattern in which black excellence is ignored until it becomes undeniable, and even then, it is often met with surprise instead of recognition. When power is rooted in perception rather than substance, it becomes fragile. That's what happened when the truth about the general's identity was revealed. The officer's authority, which seemed unshakable just moments before, began to crack. His laughter disappeared. His posture changed. Because the illusion of control is no match for the reality of earned respect. And for a brief moment, the courtroom became a place where real power, quiet, disciplined, dignified, rose to the surface. The general didn't need to raise his voice or demand recognition. He simply let the truth speak for itself. That's the essence of true leadership, knowing that your value isn't determined by others' perception of you. It's built from within, through action, sacrifice, and the unwavering understanding of your worth. That's the kind of power that lasts, even when the world tries to ignore it. It was just a phone call. Nothing loud, nothing dramatic. No shouting, no confrontation. Just a quiet moment in a courtroom filled with assumptions, and the single action that unraveled all of them. Until that moment, the black man sitting in the defendant's seat had been viewed with a certain smugness by the officer. A laugh, a glance, a dismissive attitude, all fueled by a belief that he knew exactly who he was dealing with. In the eyes of the officer, this was another typical case, another person to dismiss, another situation where the power dynamic was already settled. But one phone call shattered that illusion. The phone call wasn't to a lawyer, not to a family member, not to anyone who was going to plead for leniency or ask for help. It was a call of confirmation. A call that would change the air in the room. It wasn't the phone call itself that carried weight, it was who was on the other end, and what the response would mean. The general made that call with the calm of someone who had been here before, who had weathered storms bigger than ignorance, who understood the power of silence and timing. The officer didn't see it coming, because he never imagined that the man he had mocked had direct access to people in positions of high command. This phone call wasn't just a communication, it was a pivot. A moment where the story took a sharp turn, not because of drama, but because of truth. The truth about who this man really was. The layers that the officer had failed to consider, his service, his rank, his sacrifice, were now being validated in real time. That one call flipped the entire narrative on its head. The man who had been laughed at just moments before was now someone the officer couldn't ignore, someone the system had to acknowledge, someone whose name and reputation demanded immediate respect. It was in that moment that the courtroom's energy shifted. The people in the room felt it. The smugness disappeared. The assumptions crumbled. The officer's confidence began to falter, not because of anything physical or aggressive, but because the truth had taken the room. The power dynamic had inverted. What had been assumed to be a routine moment of superiority turned into a humbling lesson in perspective. The phone call served as a reminder that not everything is as it seems, and not everyone is who you think they are at first glance. This transformation wasn't about status or ego, it was about justice. The phone call functioned as a scalpel, cutting through the biases that had clouded judgment. The officer, who had once felt in control, was now realizing that his assumptions had blinded him. He had laughed at someone whose life experience and contributions to the nation dwarfed his own. He had mocked a man who had led soldiers, advised presidents, and defended freedoms the officer likely took for granted. That kind of realization doesn't just sting, it dismantles false confidence. The courtroom setting made the moment even more symbolic. Here was a space that is supposed to thrive on facts, on evidence, on truth. And yet, it had been tainted by perception until the phone call introduced a fact that couldn't be ignored. The officer's authority, built on assumption, was now powerless against the actual authority of the man he had tried to belittle. It wasn't about military hierarchy, it was about moral clarity. The officer had revealed his character, and now the general's quiet dignity was revealing itself in return. This one call did what no argument could have. It didn't escalate the situation, it resolved it. It exposed the gap between the truth and the assumption, the man and the myth created around him. And it made everyone watching reflect on how quickly people jump to conclusions based on nothing but appearance. The general's phone call didn't just change one person's mind, it held up a mirror to the system, asking how many others had been overlooked, disrespected, or misjudged simply because no one made a call on their behalf. The officer was left to wrestle with the consequences of his own bias. The power he had flaunted through his laughter had evaporated. Now he was left with discomfort, with embarrassment, and perhaps, for the first time, with reflection. The room had been reminded that perception is fragile when it's built on prejudice, and that truth has a way of revealing itself when you least expect it. The general didn't need to raise his voice or demand recognition. He let the facts speak. He let the silence hang heavy. He made a single call that changed everything. Respect is often seen as something earned through action, through service, through consistency of character. Yet in many spaces, it is doled out based on superficial signals, clothing, posture, skin color, visible status. In that courtroom, the Black Army general didn't walk in seeking respect. He walked in assuming that his presence, his history, and his dignity would speak for themselves. But what he encountered was something more familiar than shocking, the immediate dismissal that so many black individuals face the moment they're seen not for who they are, but for who others assume them to be. Without his uniform, the general became invisible to those who only know how to respect symbols. The badges, the stripes, the medals, those are what many people respond to. Not the human being behind them. Stripped of those visual cues, he was met with mockery, not admiration. Disregard, not deference. The officer's laugh said everything. It wasn't just about amusement, it was about establishing a hierarchy. In his mind, the general wasn't a man worthy of respect. He was someone to be looked down on. The mistake wasn't just the assumption. It was the belief that the man in front of him had done nothing to deserve even basic decency. The general didn't respond immediately. He didn't challenge the officer. He didn't assert himself through anger or confrontation. He sat with a quiet strength that comes only from someone who knows who they are. That calm, that stillness, it wasn't silence. It was control. It was patience. It was the kind of poise that can only be learned through years of discipline, through the weight of responsibility, through leading others under the most intense pressures imaginable. The officer didn't see that, because he wasn't looking for it. He saw only what he wanted to see. When the general finally made that phone call, it wasn't to demand respect. It was to reintroduce the facts. His truth had been buried under perception, and the call served to dig it out and place it squarely in front of everyone in the room. The revelation didn't come with a raised voice or a grand speech. It came with confirmation, who he was, what he had done, and why his presence should have been met with reverence, not ridicule. Suddenly, the room saw him differently. The officer, in particular, could no longer hide behind his assumptions. The man he laughed at was not just someone to respect, he was someone whose accomplishments eclipsed his own sense of authority. What made this moment so powerful wasn't just the shift in how the general was seen, but how effortlessly he maintained his composure. Even after being disrespected, he didn't demand anything. He let his record speak. He let his history defend him. That's where true respect is earned, not through flash, not through fear, but through undeniable presence. The kind of presence that doesn't ask for validation, because it's rooted in something far deeper than what the eye can see. This situation exposes the gap between performative respect and real respect. The former is conditional, it's offered when someone checks the right boxes, wears the right clothes, fits the expected mold. The latter is unconditional, it's given when someone's humanity and worth are acknowledged without question. The general's experience was a clear reminder that for many black men in America, even real respect has to be fought for, proven, or revealed in order to be given. And even then, it often arrives too late, long after the disrespect has already done its damage. In that courtroom, the general didn't win respect by speaking louder or asserting his rank. He won it by remaining who he was in the face of ignorance. His power wasn't in his title, it was in his presence. He reminded everyone, without saying much, that true respect comes from how you carry yourself when no one believes in you, when no one sees you, when no one gives you the benefit of the doubt. That's the kind of respect that's earned in silence, not because you haven't spoken, but because your life has already said enough. The officer's shift in demeanor wasn't about fear. It was about realization. Realizing that he had laughed at someone who had likely experienced things he could never understand. Realizing that his badge didn't give him the right to belittle someone who had risked everything to defend the very freedoms the justice system is supposed to uphold. The general's restraint in that moment was perhaps the clearest expression of leadership, refusing to stoop to the level of someone who had made the mistake of underestimating him. Respect, in that space, wasn't demanded or forced. It was inevitable. This story may have taken place in one courtroom, on one particular day, between two specific individuals, but its meaning reaches far beyond that space. What happened between the cop and the Black U.S. Army general is not just a personal conflict or a case of mistaken identity, it is a microcosm of a much larger issue. It is about how society views authority, how it treats race, how it defines respect, and how deeply rooted prejudice continues to shape interactions, even in the most supposedly impartial environments. This moment, brief and seemingly small, is a reflection of something systemic. It is not just about one man being laughed at. It's about an entire system that still allows, and even normalizes, that kind of laughter. The courtroom is meant to be a space of balance. It's where facts are supposed to matter more than assumptions, where each person is given a fair chance to be heard. But for Black Americans, this ideal often exists only in theory. In practice, the justice system continues to carry the weight of centuries of racial bias. This case put that imbalance on full display. A man who had served his country, risen through its military ranks, and embodied the values of discipline and sacrifice, was treated with instant disrespect based solely on his appearance. No questions asked. No curiosity. Just a reaction, a laugh. What made that laugh so powerful wasn't the sound itself. It was what it represented. It stood in for every time someone has been underestimated because of their skin color. Every time a black man or woman has walked into a room and been looked at with suspicion rather than trust. Every time qualifications, experience, or honor were ignored in favor of stereotype. It stood in for the millions of moments, big and small, when someone had to fight to be seen, to be heard, or simply to be treated like a human being. And then, one phone call turned the story upside down. But that twist, while satisfying, also reveals something troubling. Why did it take a phone call for the general to be taken seriously? Why did respect only come once status was revealed? That's the deeper issue this story exposes. In an equal society, dignity shouldn't be conditional. It shouldn't depend on rank, background, or who picks up the phone. It should be given freely, because each person is entitled to be treated with humanity, regardless of what they've accomplished or how they look. This moment matters because it is not an exception, it is a symbol. It speaks to the thousands of untold stories where the ending wasn't a moment of redemption. Where no phone call was made. Where no rank could protect someone from the weight of racial assumptions. It forces us to ask, how many people have been laughed at, dismissed, mistreated, and silenced, simply because the world didn't see their full humanity? How many stories ended in pain because there was no one in the room willing to look past their own bias? The general had something most people don't: status, connections, the ability to prove his worth with a single action. But what happens when that's not available? What happens when the person in the courtroom is a teenager, or a mother, or someone without a prestigious title behind their name? That's what makes this story bigger than one incident. It challenges us to confront the structures and attitudes that continue to uphold inequality. It reveals how fragile respect can be when it's rooted in perception rather than principle. This story also asks us to rethink how we measure value. The officer judged the general before he knew who he was. But the general's worth didn't change after the phone call. It had always been there. The only thing that changed was the perception. That shift didn't come from the general becoming more important. It came from the officer being forced to see what he had ignored. It's a lesson in the danger of assumptions, and in how often people walk through the world being unseen until they can no longer be denied. Every time we hear a story like this, we're given a choice. We can dismiss it as an isolated mistake, or we can recognize it as a signpost. A moment that calls attention to the road we're on, and the long journey that still lies ahead. This courtroom wasn't just a legal arena, it became a stage where truth and prejudice collided, where silence spoke louder than anger, and where one man's identity forced an entire room to reevaluate what it thought it knew. That kind of moment doesn't just belong to one person. It belongs to all of us.